Hello, I'm Elazer Barnette. I'm the former Dean of the School of Technology at North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University in Greensboro, North Carolina. Today I'm going to talk with you about measuring progress, assessing students for technological literacy. Measuring progress is a resource for teachers to use as they plan and implement standards-based student assessment. This presentation will focus on 5 major tenets. The first one being standards-based student assessment of technological literacy. Second being the approach to standards-based student assessment. We're going to look at student assessment tools. We're going to look at principles of assessment, and we're going to look at applying the assessment data and evaluating assessment. There are several supporting documents for this particular activity or this addenda. First one being Standards for Technological Literacy, as we call STL, and the second being Advancing Excellence in Technological Literacy, or AETL. These documents are essential to the support of the new addendum measuring progress. Let's look at the Standards for Technological Literacy, as we call STL. The 20 content standards in STL articulates what needs to be taught in the K-12 laboratory and classroom to enable students to develop technological literacy. Now, technological literacy has been defined as the ability to use, to manage, to understand, and to assess technology. Now, the standards were built around a cognitive base as well as a doing and activity base. And they include assessment checkpoints at specific grade levels of grade bands, which we'll look at K2, the 3, 5, 6, 8, and 9, 12. It is important that you remember that STL, Standards for Technological Literacy, is not a curriculum. I repeat, it is not a curriculum. It only identifies the content for the study of technology and what students should know and be able to do and understand throughout grades K through 12. The next document, AETL, consists of 3 separate but interrelated sets of standards. The first being Student Assessment Standards, then the Professional Development Standards, and then the Program Standards. The Student Assessment Standards will have 5 separate standards with 23 guidelines. The Professional Development Standards will have 7 standards with 36 guidelines, and the Program Standards will have 5 standards with 24 guidelines for teachers and 30 for administrators. Generally, assessment can be defined as the process of documenting, usually in measurable terms, the knowledge, the skills, and attitudes and beliefs. In the document measuring progress, student assessment is defined as the process of collecting evidence on student learning, understanding, and ability to inform instruction and provide feedback to the learner. We will focus on the student assessment standards for this particular activity. Again, we said there were 5, and there are 5 organizational topics. The primary audience for student assessment, of course, is teachers. And it's important to note that standards are applicable to those who educate students on any aspects of technology. Now, these 5 organizational topics focus, 1, on the consistency with STL. Again, the student learning should be explicitly matched to the intended purpose. It should be derived from research-based assessment principles, and it should be practical in its overall context, and it should incorporate the data collection system so you can focus on the overall accountability and professional development that we can report back to the various supporters or stakeholders for the program. When we start connecting student assessment with standards, again, we look at the big picture. We need to focus in this particular instance on the student assessment. Standards-based student assessments for technology literacy, again, there's some questions that we need to raise. Where are we now? Where do we want to go? How do we get there? When we think about the where are we now, we want to focus again on evaluating the overall course. What is the overall health of your course? Is it healthy or not? We might need to take it to the doctor. Where do you want to go with it? Well, if we need to go to the doctor will be classified as those standards, or the content standards, STL or AETL. And how do we get there? We utilize those standards. What knowledge and abilities must educators possess? Then it's important to focus on professional development and continuous professional development. And how do we know when we have arrived? We know when we have arrived when the assessment again, can be aligned with our standards or overall intended purpose. We talked about standards-based. How do you know if your program is standards-based or is it basically standard reflected? Well, when we think about standards-based, the assessment starts with the content standards as a base. And then it develops specific learning goals. And then it establishes assessment criteria against which understanding is judged. Looking now at standards reflected assessment, the assessment usually starts with an assessment tool or a method, and it attempts to make a connection to the standard. Again, it attempts to make the connection. In other words, the standards becomes an afterthought instead of being based upon developing assessment practice. We highly recommend that you focus on standards-based student assessment. Now, let's look at this particular approach for standards-based student assessment. First of all, we need to realize that this is not a single event, moment in time activity. Wiggins and Mattei talks with us, gives us information about this, and it's not only a single event, but it's a collection over a period of time. Now let's look at the 5 components. 1, we identify the content standards. And once we identify the content standards from STL, we focus on the appropriate benchmarks. Second, we need to extract and organize our content. We extract and organize the content really from the benchmarks. So we look at the big ideas from our benchmarks. You need to define the assessment criteria. What is it that you want the students to understand? Choose the appropriate assessment tools and methods. And then you use assessment as a result. In other words, use feedback to improve the overall teaching and learning. In the illustration that you see here, we start now looking at the same 5 steps at the course level. When we look at the course level, you see the same 5 steps we just talked with you about. This can happen at the unit level as well. And at the unit level, unit is one component of a course. The course normally defines an overall period of time, such as 9 weeks, or it could be the semester, whereas the unit is a topic that happens within a particular course. But in any event, you continue to follow the same 5 steps as you look at the approach towards standards-based assessment for technological literacy. You may have several units. Again, it's the same approach. Or even if it's a program, you look at the same basic 5 steps. And a program is inclusive of everything that happens in the overall teaching and learning environment. In the appendices of our measuring process, you will find several forms that will be useful as you look at student assessment. Now here's one where we look again at the basic 5 steps where you want to select the content standards and identify your basic benchmarks. And you can see where we have the ideas, the big ideas, etc. The second part talked about defining the criteria. If you look at overall defining the criteria, you pull from your benchmarks, as I moved also down to step 3, you look at your ideas. Now many times the big ideas may be part of the benchmarks or come from your benchmarks as indicated earlier. But what I want to focus on, you see where we've already defined what we want or what we feel is important for the students to understand. And that is what will happen if they are at target, which would be about the middle, or what happens when you're below target, or what happens when you're above target. In other words, we want to continue to define where the students are on the overall continuum towards technological literacy. There are a variety of assessment tools that can be used, and it is important that you don't choose just one assessment tool, that you look at several assessment tools because of the overall makeup of the students that you will find in your particular classroom. Some of them, as you see, and I will not talk about all of them, but conceptual mapping, debate, you have a variety. Most of us are familiar with the multiple choice type test, but one we're not so familiar with, and in some cases would be portfolio development. We're also familiar with the project, but again, the focus here is that the teacher must use a variety of assessment tools to help determine the overall student understanding. Scoring. Scoring, grading, measuring, and judging or assigning value, whether using multiple choice tests or other design or other tools that you use, you might want to consider individual student achievement. However, you must avoid assessment tools that provide subjective evidence or student learning and choose tools that provide more objective evidence of student learning. And for example, you have a checklist, and a checklist can be used to evaluate a device, normally in a form or a simple listing where you can check it out to determine whether the student knows or they do not know a particular component. However, I want to talk with you a little bit about a rubric. The rubric is as central as a 2-dimensional matrix. that provides criteria against which to assess students' performance. One axis, as you can see, represents a set of concepts, elements, traits, or big ideas, while the other axis defines the level of achievement. The two axes, one vertical and one horizontal, form a rows and columns. As you can see in the rubrics, again, you have a beginning, a developing, a accomplishing, and exemplary. In other words, as a teacher, you have an idea of what your expectation will be of the students, as again related to the standards, as well as the benchmarks that have been defined, as you see on the side. What are the big ideas? Now let's look at the overall principles. Now, the principles are not an afterthought of assessment. It's an integral part of the overall assessment system or assessment process. You need to focus on utilizing fair and equitable student assessment methods. Again, you need to focus on not being biased or having discriminatory practices within the overall assessment system. You need to establish valid and reliable measurements. In other words, are you measuring what you said or what the intended purpose will be? And really, what about the repeatability of your overall measurements? You need to reflect on, again, on the current research and on student learning and assessment. Again, we know that student learning continuously changes, and teachers need to know what's new so that they can make adjustments in the overall program. You need to incorporate both formative and summative student assessment. Now, formative focuses on what the teachers normally do every day. The typical questions are short answer response. However, the summative assessment normally occurs at the end of the unit or the course, normally in the form of a portfolio development, a test, etc. The other part is enhancing student learning. That's what it's all about. You want to know if you're doing what you set out to do to overall increase the student learning and, again, moving the students towards technological literacy. You need to allow for the student commonalities and diversity. In the classroom, you have a variety of learning styles, also cultural differences. So you need to plan, when you look at your overall assessment, how you plan for those differences as well as those commonalities. You need to include students in the assessment process. Many times we plan assessment without thinking about the students need to be involved. Students need to be helpful as you define the overall assessment process. And normally students find this fun, and they really feel that they in a better position in the overall teaching and learning environment with learning about what's required for the assessment component. You need to reflect on the current technological content. Again, staying current with what's happening, what you're planning to deliver, and you need to utilize authentic assessment. Again, it should be real to the student as you go through the overall assessment process. And as I said earlier, it's not an afterthought, but it should be an integral component of the overall assessment system. As we look at applying assessment data and evaluating assessment, first of all, we make use of assessment results. Assessment data provides information that enables the teacher and others to really determine or make appropriate decisions about the teaching and learning environment. And all educators must pay special attention to the original purpose for which the assessment was intended. The second component is evaluating student assessment. And it says, with any process, we must evaluate the overall quality of the student assessment, and we need to, or we could utilize some of the forms of other resources we have available so we'll be able to link opportunities to student assessment to technological literacy standards. And again, it's important that you provide feedback in the overall process so that you can tweak or move your programs forward. One form that's useful that we find in measuring process is an evaluation form where we can kind of go back as a checklist to determine, have we arrived yet? And again, have we really matched up, aligned our standards as we design for our overall intended purpose? In summary, measuring progress is a guide for assuring students for, measuring progress is a guide for assessing students for technological literacy. One must remember assessment is an ongoing and continuous process. We say that again, it's ongoing and continuous, it's not a one-time event. And curriculum designers should incorporate how new curriculum will be assessed and how data from the assessment process will be used to provide continuous curriculum improvements. We kind of end with this piece from NEA and NRC. A journey. Assessment is a journey, not a destination. At the heart of our modern technological society lies an unacknowledged paradox. Although the United States is increasingly defined by and dependent upon technology and has adopted new technologies at a breathtaking pace, its citizens are not equipped to make well-considered decisions or to think critically about technology. And as a society, we are not even fully aware of the conversions with the technologies we use every day. In short, we are not technologically literate. I thank you for listening to this presentation. If you need additional information about this presentation, you can contact me at my phone number or the email address that's provided for you. Also, this presentation was developed from a grant to ITEEA by the National Education Association. And for more information on ITEEA standards and technological literacy, you can contact standards specialists or the professional development and curriculum. You can contact the International Technology Education Association at the address provided. Thank you again.